Can increasing load actually help prevent injuries such as repetitive stress injuries or overload conditions? Find out in this episode of Monday Mornings with Michael. Let's start off with discussing how we monitor load. So there's two types of load that we'll have to monitor: external and internal loads. External loads are what we're typically most familiar with. So that would be monitoring distance or time. So let's say that we went for a 30-minute run or like a 5-mile run, something like that. Those are both external ways of monitoring load. Whereas internal load is the actual amount of stress on your body. So the way that we monitor those are heart rate or like a ratings of perceived exertion, which is just rating the difficulty of exercise from a scale of 1 to 10. Monitoring both external and internal loads are important because just because someone runs 5 miles or 30 minutes or whatever we use to describe external loads, doesn't mean that the internal loads will be the same. So if we have an elite runner, right, they're going to find 5 miles very easy to do, whereas someone who's not very active or who hasn't exercised much, 5 miles is going to be a lot. So we need to take both external and internal loads into consideration. The way that we calculate workload is we'll take the internal load and multiply it by the external load. So let's take the runner for an example. And they rated their workout as a 5 out of 10, and they ran for 60 minutes. So we take 5 times 60, and we get 300 units. There's two different types of workload. An acute workload is typically the amount of load that we place on the body during a short amount of time. So typically that's either one session or a week, and that will depend on the actual exercise. If we take that runner, for example, they're probably going to run multiple times throughout the week. So our acute workload will be the weekly workload. Whereas if we have a football player, they're really only going to have one game a week. So their acute workload will probably be just one session. A chronic workload is the rolling average of the last 3 to 6 weeks. So this is kind of the amount of load that the body's going to be able to tolerate. So what we'll do is we'll take the weekly workloads and we'll combine them to create a chronic workload. Just because it can be a little bit chaotic with all these numbers, I'm going to keep a nice little tab over here so that way we'll be able to keep them straight. So let's take that runner, and they rated their workout as a 5 out of 10, and they ran for 60 minutes, so that means 300 units was their workload. And then they worked out 3 times that week, so that means their acute workload was 900 units. So to keep the math easy, let's say for a chronic workload, we'll take the 4 weeks. So we'll multiply 900 times 4 and get 3,600 units, so that will be our chronic workload. Now we'll take all of these numbers over here and we'll make a ratio. So we'll do what's called an acute chronic workload ratio. And so this will be able to tell us how much stress we're putting on the body. A ratio of less than 1 means that we're putting less load on the body than it's accustomed to. So that means that our chronic workload is higher than our acute workload. If the ratio is more than 1, it means that the acute workload is more than the chronic workload, which means that we're putting more load than what the body is used to being able to tolerate. This is going to be where we're setting ourselves up for a risk of injury because we're putting too much load on the body. From Tim Gavitt's research, who is a researcher on load management and injury prevention, they found what's called a sweet spot. And so for the acute chronic workload ratio, we want to stay between 0.8 and 1.3. In this range, they found that the risk of injury is less than either not loading enough, which would be less than 0.8, or loading too much, which would be more than 1.5. So what does all this mean? Acute workload, chronic workload, acute chronic workload ratio, what does it all mean? Well, if we're looking at reducing our risk of injury, we want to gradually increase our chronic workload, as that's been shown to be protective against injury. So if we're monitoring our load, we don't want to increase more than 10% per week. So that runner who's running about 900 units, the next week we only want to go to maybe about 990, about 1,000. We don't want to increase up to 1,800 as that's far too much and that's going to put them at risk of injury. From a rehab perspective, typically when somebody's injured, they've taken a couple weeks off because of either the injury or the pain, which means that their acute and their chronic workloads have decreased. If we simply just let them rest, let the tissues heal, and then try to resume activity, we've exposed them to a sudden increase in load, which is going to set them up for the potential of another injury. So instead, the rehab program should slowly build up their workload again, so that way they can tolerate the loads that they're going to put on it when they go back to running or sport or whatever it is. Generally in the rehab programs, we're scared that by placing load on them, we're actually going to be delaying healing or making an injury worse, but turns out we're actually probably setting them up for failure by not loading them appropriately during the rehab setting.
Thank you guys so much for watching another episode of Monday Mornings with Michael. I hope that you guys found this information useful. If you did, please like this video and don't forget to subscribe. Until then, I'm just going to hold this plank until you go ahead and push subscribe. Go ahead and push subscribe. I don't know how long I can hold this plank. Just click that button right there.